In the stillness of an early summer morning, a lone rider moved slowly along a narrow road in Essex. His horse's hooves struck the hard earth with a hollow rhythm, carrying him past fields that should have been rich with life, but lay strangely silent. Once these lands had been filled with voices, the laughter of children, and the measured beat of sickles cutting through wheat. But now the cottages were empty, roofs sagging, and the hedgerows crept over ground long untended. Not far off stood a churchyard, its rough wooden markers leaning at odd angles, weathered by rain and wind. They told the story of a disaster that had struck a generation earlier, a calamity so vast that it reshaped England itself. The Black Death had come to the kingdom in 1347, and within a few short years had claimed perhaps half of the population. Families were wiped out, villages deserted, parishes left without priests to say the last rites. The loss was not only human, but structural. Entire patterns of work and obligation broke down. The survivors, scarce and suddenly valuable, discovered their labor was in demand. Landowners, desperate for tenants, found themselves bargaining with men and women who only a few years earlier had been bound in near servitude. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if society might bend toward fairness. But those in power resisted. In 1351, Parliament had enacted the Statute of Laborers, attempting to force wages back to what they had been before the plague, to tie workers to their lords and prevent them from moving freely. It was law imposed against reality, an effort to chain the living to a dead order. The countryside bore its scars in more ways than one, in the emptiness of its villages, in the bitterness of its people, in the sense that justice served only those already strong. To this burden was added the weight of a war that seemed endless. England's kings pursued glory and territory in France, and every campaign demanded coin. Ships had to be built, soldiers paid, castles provisioned. The ordinary people, already worn down, were expected to shoulder the load. Traditional revenues no longer sufficed, so the government turned to a new and deeply unpopular measure, the poll tax. Unlike other levies, this was not based on land or trade, but on existence itself. Every adult above a certain age owed the same amount, whether lord or shepherd. The first such tax in 1377 was grudgingly endured. A second in 1379 deepened discontent. When the third was ordered in 1381, it touched a raw nerve. For families living at the edge of survival, even a few pennies could mean hunger or the loss of livestock. To be forced to pay simply because one lived was to feel mocked by authority. The realm's ministers may have seen only numbers on parchment, but in cottages and village greens, those numbers were measured against bread, wool, and dignity. Daily life became increasingly tense. A father guiding his oxen through the soil knew that much of his harvest would be claimed by others. A mother spinning wool at her hearth listened for the dreaded knock that might summon her to answer for unpaid dues. Children sensed the fear that hung over their homes. Manor courts summoned villagers, bailiffs pressed for arrears, and the king's officers appeared less as guardians of order than as predators in official garb. Rumors began to circulate. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered of resistance. Tales of villages refusing the collector, of men daring to defy the law, traveled from county to county. The memory of shared suffering during the plague had taught the people that they were bound together in more than hardship. That memory now nourished a dangerous thought. If they stood together, perhaps they could resist. It was into such a climate that the rider of our opening scene arrived. He was a tax collector, charged with gathering the latest poll tax from a weary population. Carrying the authority of the crown, he expected obedience. Yet as he reached the village green and unfurled his orders, the faces before him were not submissive. The crowd was small but tense, men and women who had carried burdens too long. Their clothes were simple, their hands calloused from labor, but their eyes shone with something new. An elderly woman shook her head and refused. A young man stepped forward, defiance clear in his stance. A murmur spread through the crowd, low at first, then rising. At that moment, silence fell. It was the silence that comes before a storm breaks, the pause in which people recognize their own strength. What began as a single confrontation in a quiet village was more than an isolated act of defiance. It was the echo of decades of strain, the devastation of plague, the injustice of law, the hunger of war, and the arrogance of rulers blind to suffering. In that silence, the old order trembled, though it did not yet know it. Soon, Essex and Kent would become the cradle of a rising that shook the kingdom. Soon, roads leading toward London would be filled with footsteps, and the voice of common men and women would demand to be heard. The revolt of 1381 was not merely about taxes, nor merely about peasants with farm tools raised in anger. It was about the relationship between rulers and ruled, about the right to dignity in a world that had too long denied it. And in this moment, on the edge of a village green, the story of that revolt began. From the spark in one village, the flame began to spread. In Essex, the resistance to the tax was no longer an isolated act of defiance, but a growing movement that drew strength from the common grievances of the countryside. When royal officials pressed households to hand over their payments, they met refusal, not from one or two, but from entire communities who had resolved together that they would endure no more. It was not simply the weight of the tax that stung them, but the sense that their lives were treated as commodities, that their voices counted for nothing in the kingdom they sustained with their labor. In the manor courts, clerks attempted to enforce the king's command. They demanded rolls of names, tallies of households, and the precise sums owed by each man and woman. But the villagers pushed back, questioning the authority of those who brought such orders. Some declared that they had already paid. Others insisted that they owed nothing at all. More often, they simply refused outright. The clash was not yet of swords or weapons, but of words and wills. Officials accustomed to obedience found themselves outnumbered by determined men and women whose patience had reached its end. In Essex, a collector attempting to press his claim was driven away amid jeers. In neighboring Kent, the same defiance rose with equal force. Across the two counties, messengers carried tales of villages that had turned against authority. Each account emboldened the next settlement. What began as hesitation became open declaration. The tax would not be paid. Officials attempting to enforce the levy were surrounded and compelled to abandon their mission. The momentum was building, and with it came a sense of shared purpose that transcended local quarrels. The omniscient gaze falls upon the roads that thread through these counties. Once quiet paths for traders and pilgrims, now they became channels of rumor and resolve. A traveler leaving Essex might hear of a confrontation at a market town where peasants had barred the way to the taxman. In Kent, he would be told that neighbors had sworn an oath to resist together. The sense that we are not alone grew stronger with each retelling, as the people of the countryside discovered themselves part of a rising tide. The local gentry confronted with this challenge were uncertain. Some tried to enforce their authority by summoning villagers before them, but the summons went unanswered. Others retreated, sensing that force could not easily be applied when entire communities stood united. In certain towns, guild members and craftsmen joined the refusal, linking urban discontent with rural defiance. The boundaries between peasant and townsman, between village and city, began to blur as the cause spread. From the vantage of Westminster, the first reports may have seemed like disturbances, troublesome but containable. Yet each day brought new accounts of refusal, of officials turned away, of unrest spreading like ripples across a pond. What the government perceived as disobedience, the people experienced as liberation. For the first time, they had looked authority in the face and found it faltering. The narrative of Essex and Kent at this moment is one of awakening. These counties were not chosen by destiny, but by circumstance and courage. They were close enough to London to sense the weight of royal power, yet far enough to act without immediate reprisal. The men and women here had endured the same hardships as the rest of the kingdom, but when pressed one time too, many, they drew a line. Their refusal to pay was more than an economic protest. It was the assertion of dignity, the claim that their lives could not be endlessly measured in coin. In the fields of Essex, a farmer put down his plow and joined his neighbors on the green, knowing that the collector would arrive and that his presence was required. In the villages of Kent, blacksmiths, herdsmen, and servants gathered to voice their decision together. These were not seasoned rebels trained for confrontation. They were ordinary people drawn into extraordinary action by the simple act of saying no. The scene is one of confrontation, but also of clarity. When the official approached, holding his writ in the name of the king, the villagers did not scatter. They stood. Their tools were still in their hands, plowshares, hammers, staffs, but now they served as symbols of defiance rather than mere instruments of work. The officials, realizing that resistance was not the act of a lone troublemaker, but the united will of the community, withdrew. From these moments, the revolt truly began. Essex and Kent had lit the fire that would soon consume the attention of the realm. The refusal to pay was not only an act of rebellion, it was a signal, a message carried by word of mouth across hedgerows and rivers. The people had discovered their strength, and they would not easily return to silence. Thus, the revolt of 1381 took its first breath, not in the roar of armies or the clash of battle, but in the calm, stubborn refusal of villagers to bend once more beneath the weight of unjust demands. From this beginning, the path toward London opened, and the kingdom itself would soon feel the force of a people determined to be heard. From the villages of Essex and Kent, where defiance first took root, the revolt gathered not only momentum but also leaders, men whose names would echo through the chronicles of 1381. They were not kings or barons, trained in courts and castles, but figures who rose from the margins, each carrying a different kind of authority. Their voices and actions shaped the spirit of the uprising, transforming scattered acts of refusal into a movement that could not be ignored. Among them was John Ball, a radical priest whose words, though often silenced by imprisonment, carried a power the chains could not contain. For years, he had preached a message that unsettled both bishops and lords. When Adam delved and Eve span, he asked, who was then the gentleman? It was a question as sharp as any blade, cutting to the heart of England's rigid hierarchy. Ball's sermons suggested a vision of society where the divisions of rank were not divine law, but human invention. Though the church imprisoned him for such teachings, his words had already taken root among the common people, spreading by memory and whisper, like embers carried on the wind. Even locked away, he remained a spiritual guide for the restless. To peasants weary of burdens and blind injustice, his vision seemed less like rebellion and more like truth long denied. Yet words alone could not marshal a revolt. The people also needed a leader who could embody their cause, command their trust, and carry them forward. That figure emerged in the person of Wat Tyler. Little is known with certainty of his earlier life. The records of the time did not linger on men of his station. Some said he was a tiler by trade, a craftsman skilled with his hands. Others claimed he was simply a farmer, rooted in the soil like those he would one day lead. What mattered more than origins was his character, decisive, bold, and unafraid to stand at the front when danger loomed. Tyler became the practical leader of the revolt, the one who could transform outrage into action. Under his guidance, groups of villagers did not merely resist but organized. He directed marches, encouraged discipline, and turned scattered gatherings into a moving force. Chroniclers, though often hostile to the rebels, could not help but acknowledge the authority he commanded. To the peasants, he was more than a spokesman. He was the man who dared to speak on their behalf to kings. Alongside Tyler stood others whose names, though less celebrated, reveal the breadth of the uprising. Jack Straw, remembered as a companion and co-leader, symbolized the willingness of ordinary men to step into history. His role, like that of many local leaders, was to rally his own community, to persuade neighbors that their grievances were shared and their courage must be collective. Across towns and villages, figures like Straw multiplied, small leaders who carried the spirit of revolt from one green to the next. The omniscient gaze turns now to these gatherings. A barn filled with villagers listening to a trusted neighbor explain the purpose of their march. A roadside clearing where men swear an oath to join Tyler's band. A quiet moment in which a scrap of parchment bearing John Ball's words is passed from hand to hand. Each scene, small in itself, contributed to a larger tapestry. The revolt was not only an eruption of anger, but also a network of voices, bound together by common cause. The government viewed these figures with alarm. A rebellious priest who questioned the order of creation, a craftsman turned commander who could draw thousands into his orbit, and local leaders who multiplied the cause like sparks from a fire. Together, they represented a threat unlike any England had seen. No single manner could contain them, no single decree silence them. Yet from the perspective of the common people, these leaders were less conspirators than champions. John Ball gave them a vision of justice. Wat Tyler gave them discipline and daring. And Jack Straw gave them proof that anyone, no matter how humble, could stand against the mighty. Each man was a symbol, and together they embodied a truth long hidden. That authority could be challenged not only by nobles and princes, but by the people themselves. By the time the revolt surged toward its height, these figures were inseparable from its identity. Their names traveled with the marchers, spoken with respect and hope. Ball's words were repeated like scripture. Tyler's commands were followed as law. Straw's presence reminded each village that their own sons could stand in the forefront. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt acquired its leaders, unlikely, imperfect, yet powerful in the moment. They gave voice to a movement born of silence, order to a force born of chaos, and meaning to a struggle born of necessity. From prison cells and workshops, from village greens and crowded markets, they rose, not by the grace of title, but by the will of the people. And in their rising, the rebellion gained its soul. Even before the marchers gathered in great numbers, the rebellion of 1381 was already shaped by words. The countryside hummed with a language of justice that had never before been spoken so openly. It was not the language of charters or statutes written by clerks in Westminster, but of sermons whispered in barns, of verses repeated in fields, of questions that unsettled the foundations of privilege. Out of this world of secret speech emerged a new and dangerous thought, that all men and women, fashioned by the same Creator, were bound together by something deeper than the ranks imposed upon them. At the heart of this revolution of words was John Ball. Though confined at times by the church for his defiance, his message could not be contained by stone walls. He spoke of a society in which no one was born master and no one destined to be serf. His words rang with simplicity and clarity. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In that question lay a radical vision. If in the beginning all had labored with their hands, then the divisions that now chained peasants to lords were not part of divine order, but inventions of men. By the firelight of evening, villagers would gather to hear these sermons. The scene is almost cinematic. A low-roofed barn filled with shadows, a single torch or candle casting long shapes across the faces of listeners. Ball's voice, steady and urgent, carries through the hush. Farmers, craftsmen, women who spun wool by day, and youths restless for change lean closer, their eyes lit not just by flame, but by conviction. They hear not only a priest, but a prophet of their own condition, giving form to the unspoken. The omniscient gaze reveals how such words spread. One man, stirred by the sermon, carries the phrase to his neighbor. A woman repeats it at the village well. Children overhear and recite it without fully understanding, carrying it like a song. Soon, across Essex, Kent, and beyond, Ball's words echo as if carried by the wind. They are woven into conversations at markets and whispered at the edges of churchyards. The idea that society might be leveled, that those who toil deserve the same dignity as those who rule, takes hold of imaginations. This was a revolution not of parchment, but of memory. The ruling elite could confiscate books, imprison preachers, or decree silence, but they could not erase what had been heard and remembered. Ball's words lived in the minds of the people, shaping the very way they saw themselves. To men and women who had long endured taxes and decrees without question, the message was liberating. They were not lesser by nature, but made lesser by custom. And custom, unlike creation, could be changed. In this sense, the Peasants' Revolt was already underway before the first march to London. The rebellion of 1381 was carried not only on feet, but on tongues. Each conversation became a spark, each retelling a kind of oath. To resist the poll tax was one act. To imagine a world without lords and serfs was another, and far more profound. To the authorities, these words were as dangerous as any weapon. A blade could be seized, but an idea could not be confined. What terrified bishops and barons alike was not just that Ball had spoken, but that countless others were now repeating. In their view, it was not simply rebellion, but heresy, a challenge not only to social order, but to the very framework of God's design, as they understood it. Yet from the people's perspective, these sermons did not reject faith, but fulfilled it. Ball spoke not against God, but for a truer justice rooted in creation itself. His message gave the revolt its soul. The peasants were not merely fighting taxes, they were asserting their place in the order of the world. Thus, on nights when firelight flickered on weathered faces, when Ball's words settled deep into the hearts of listeners, the Peasants' Revolt found its voice. It was a voice that did not belong to any single man, but to a people awakening to their own strength. And once spoken, it could not be recalled. It would march with them toward London as surely as any leader, and it would echo long after the revolt was crushed, a testament to the power of language to stir the imagination of the humble and to challenge the mighty. From the first defiant villages in Essex and Kent, the rising gathered strength with astonishing speed. What began as small gatherings of neighbors on village greens soon became columns of marchers moving along the roads, their numbers swelling with each mile. Entire communities joined as one, leaving behind fields and hearths to answer a call that felt larger than themselves. Within days, thousands were on the move, bound together not by written command, but by shared resolve. The omniscient gaze sweeps across the countryside. A stream of people flowing down dusty lanes, men and women walking side by side, some carrying bundles of bread or cheese, others clutching tools hastily fashioned into makeshift arms. The scythe, once meant for hay, now glints in the sun as a weapon of defiance. The hammer used for building now hangs at the side of its bearer as a symbol of determination. Children, too, young to march watch from doorways as their parents join the throng, their faces half fearful, half proud. As the multitude grew, so did its sense of unity. Villages that had once known each other only as rivals in trade or disputes over land now discovered common cause. From Essex came farmers hardened by years of toil. From Kent, craftsmen and townsmen eager to prove that the burden of unjust taxes was shared by all. The banners they carried were not fine silks, but scraps of cloth raised high on poles, bearing simple marks or colors to identify their home parish. To the marchers, these flags became emblems of pride, fluttering above the sea of people as they pressed forward. The sound of the movement was unlike anything England had heard before. It was not the thunder of an army's drums, nor the trumpets of heralds, but the steady rhythm of thousands of footsteps, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional cry of encouragement that rippled down the line. At night, when they rested in fields or on the edges of towns, the glow of their campfires stretched into the distance, a constellation of resistance visible across the countryside. What astonished contemporaries was not only the size of the rising, but its speed. Within a short time, tens of thousands had joined. Chroniclers, though divided in their sympathies, agreed that the scale was unprecedented. It was as if the entire southern half of the kingdom had risen from the soil. Men left plows standing in furrows. Women entrusted their homes to neighbors. Apprentices abandoned workshops. The ordinary rhythm of life was suspended, replaced by the extraordinary rhythm of a people on the march. And yet, despite the roughness of their tools and the improvised nature of their banners, there was discipline of a kind. The marchers did not dissolve into chaos. Guided by local leaders and the steady hand of Wat Tyler, they kept to the roads, gathered food from sympathetic towns, and pressed onward with purpose. Their destination was clear: London, the heart of the kingdom, the place where their grievances could no longer be ignored. The omniscient narrator lingers on the symbolism of this march. It was not merely a journey of bodies, but of ideas. Each step carried the weight of John Ball's words, the conviction that those who labored deserved the same dignity as those who ruled. Each banner, no matter how humble, was a declaration that their parish stood with the cause. Each tool raised aloft was proof that the instruments of survival could also serve as instruments of change. To those who watched them pass, the spectacle was unforgettable. A reeve standing at the edge of his village saw neighbors transformed from quiet tenants into determined marchers. A merchant in a market town, hearing the roar of their approach, glimpsed a crowd stretching as far as the eye could see, a living river of humanity carrying with it the force of justice long denied. From the perspective of the crown, this gathering was deeply alarming. An army of peasants and townsmen, untrained but countless, was moving toward the capital. No levy of knights had been summoned. No royal command had called them. Yet here they were, tens of thousands strong, advancing not with fear, but with certainty. It was a vision of the people as a power in their own right, a vision that threatened to overturn the very structure of authority. Still, for the marchers themselves, the mood was not one of savagery, but of hope. They believed they were moving toward a reckoning in which the king would hear their pleas, abolish unjust laws, and recognize their worth. Many still placed their faith in the crown, distinguishing between the boy king Richard II and the corrupt advisors who surrounded him. Their banners bore not only parish signs but also symbols of loyalty to the realm, for they imagined their revolt as a path to justice within, not beyond, the kingdom. Thus the march unfolded, a spectacle of ordinary people transformed into a force that could not be ignored. The fields of Essex and Kent emptied into the roads. The roads converged into highways of protest. The highways led inexorably to London. What awaited there no one yet knew, but the sight of this multitude, tens of thousands united in step and purpose, was enough to mark the summer of 1381 as unlike any England had ever seen. As the marchers pressed onward, the revolt took on a new character. What had begun as a collective refusal to pay the poll tax now swelled into a direct challenge to the structures of power that had long weighed upon the people. In villages, towns, and eventually larger market centers, the rebels turned not only against officials who represented the crown, but also against the symbols of authority that defined their lives. Manor houses, government offices, and even local jails became targets, not because of their walls or roofs, but because of what they contained. The first to feel the force of this rising were the records. To the rebels, rolls of parchment were more than harmless sheets of ink and vellum. They were chains. Within those rolls lay the calculations of taxes, the names of tenants bound by obligations, the fines recorded against those who had erred, and the tallies that reduced men and women to marks on a page. By seizing and destroying them, the rebels believed they were striking at the very heart of oppression. In flames and torn scraps, the burdens of generations seemed, for a moment, to vanish. Imagine the scene as the omniscient gaze lingers. A group of villagers breaking into a manorial office, shelves lined with rolls neatly bound in ribbon. With deliberate purpose, they scatter them across the floor, untying knots that once bound their names to servitude. The fire outside grows, and parchment curls as if releasing the weight of centuries. For the first time, men and women accustomed to bowing their heads before authority feel the strange liberation of tearing it down. Alongside the destruction of records came the liberation of people. Prisons and jails, symbols of law's stern hand, were thrown open. Chains clattered to the ground as those held for debt, disobedience, or defiance of lords stepped into the light of freedom. To the rebels, these acts were not mere vandalism but proclamations of justice. If the written word had been used to bind them, then erasing those words was an act of renewal. If their neighbors had been punished for resisting, then freeing them was a declaration that the old punishments no longer stood. This wave of destruction and liberation carried with it a powerful symbolism. The revolt was no longer about one tax or one grievance. It was about unmaking a system. To burn records was to deny the permanence of hierarchy. To open jails was to assert that the people themselves could decide who was free and who was bound. The old order, with its lords and clerks, its seals and ledgers, seemed suddenly fragile. In its place, for a fleeting moment, stood the possibility of a different England. The chroniclers of the age, writing with horror, described these acts as lawless outrages. Yet from the perspective of the marchers, they were acts of restoration. They were not looting aimlessly nor destroying for the sake of chaos. They sought out the instruments of control, the very documents and prisons that defined their oppression. Each act was deliberate, carrying with it the thrill of overturning what had seemed unchangeable. The atmosphere among the rebels grew electric. To see the rolls of obligation burn was to feel centuries of silence break. To march past the opened doors of a jail and see former prisoners joining their ranks was to believe that they were not merely protesting, but reshaping the kingdom itself. Conversations carried this sense of wonder. Men and women who had once spoken in whispers now spoke boldly of justice, of freedom, of a new order where the burdens of the past would no longer define their lives. In towns sympathetic to their cause, the marchers were met with cheers. Crowds of apprentices and craftsmen joined in, eager to see the destruction of records that had long favored the wealthy. The revolt thus spread not only by fear, but by inspiration. Each burning document, each freed prisoner became a story retold in the next town, amplifying the sense that the kingdom was shifting beneath their feet. The omniscient narrator reflects, "This was the moment when the rebellion revealed its true nature. It was not merely an assembly of peasants angered by attacks. It was a movement that struck at the very legitimacy of the old order. In their hands, farm tools became weapons not just of defense, but of transformation. In their voices, the murmur of discontent became a declaration that the rules by which England had long been governed could be undone." Thus, as they advanced toward London, the rebels carried with them not only numbers, but also momentum born of these victories. They had broken the hold of records, freed their neighbors, and shown themselves capable of challenging the authority of lords and officers. For a few extraordinary weeks in the summer of 1381, the old order trembled, and a new one seemed close enough to touch. The rising tide that swept through Essex and Kent did not take long to reach the ears of the crown. In Westminster and the royal court, news arrived daily of villages refusing obedience, of records destroyed, of prisoners released, and of marchers now numbering in the tens of thousands. The corridors of authority, accustomed to command and compliance, trembled with uncertainty. At the heart of the realm sat Richard II, scarcely more than a boy of 14. He wore the crown, but he did not yet command the weight of years or the seasoned judgment of experience. The chroniclers remind us that he was tall for his age, handsome, with the regal bearing of his Plantagenet line. But behind the symbols of majesty stood a youth untested in the storms of politics. When he had ascended the throne in 1377, the kingdom had placed its hopes in his promise. Yet now that promise faced its first great trial. The council surrounding the young king was itself divided. Some lords urged decisive action, to summon armed levies, to ride out against the rebels with force, and to crush the disorder before it spread further. To them, hesitation invited disaster. Each day's delay allowed the insurgents to gather strength and courage. Others counseled caution. The numbers reported were staggering, far exceeding what could be quickly mustered in loyal arms. To engage prematurely risked not victory, but catastrophe. Between these extremes lay a fearful indecision. The omniscient gaze shifts to the great hall where the king's advisors argued. On one side, stern voices demanded immediate suppression, invoking the honor of the crown and the need to uphold order. On the other, wary tones emphasized the sheer scale of the uprising, the danger of inflaming it further, and the importance of preserving the king's person above all. For in truth, Richard himself was the crown's most fragile treasure, a child sovereign whose safety was the condition upon which the realm's unity precariously rested. Behind these debates lay another reality. The nobility themselves were divided not only in council but in interest. Some had long been targets of resentment, their estates singled out by the rebels, their names cursed on village greens. John of Gaunt, uncle to the king and one of the most powerful men in England, found his palace in London marked for destruction. Others, less hated, calculated whether compromise might preserve their influence more effectively than confrontation. Thus, the rebellion exposed not only the fault lines between rulers and ruled, but also the fractures within the ruling elite itself. To the boy king, the weight of these disputes must have been heavy. Chroniclers describe him as calm in bearing, even bold in moments when older men faltered. Yet we must imagine the reality. A 14-year-old suddenly called to embody the majesty of England against tens of thousands of his own subjects. The courtiers who bowed before him also whispered in corners, unsure whether he could hold the crown secure. The air in Westminster was thick with fear, suspicion, and indecision. As the marchers drew closer to London, the government faced impossible choices. Could they meet the rebels on the field? The forces available were few, and loyalty uncertain. Could they retreat behind the walls of the capital? That would signal weakness, perhaps invite the rebels to press harder. Could they parley? To many lords, negotiation with commoners seemed unthinkable, a humiliation that would set a dangerous precedent. Yet to refuse might bring the very collapse they dreaded. Thus the court wavered. Orders were given and revoked. Letters were dispatched to loyal sheriffs, urging them to muster men, yet few responded with haste. The machinery of power, so formidable in parchment and seal, faltered when confronted by the living multitude approaching the city. The omniscient narrator pauses to note the irony. In this moment of greatest peril, authority itself seemed weakest. The peasants, long dismissed as voiceless, were moving with unity and purpose, while the lords of the realm, accustomed to command, hesitated and quarreled. The boy upon the throne was asked to show the steadiness that his elders could not. The rebellion of 1381 thus forced England into an unfamiliar posture. The mighty feared, the humble advanced, and the kingdom held its breath. Richard II, scarcely past childhood, now stood at the threshold of a confrontation that would test not only his courage, but the very foundation of royal power. The response of the crown was still uncertain, yet the march of the people would not wait. Step by step they closed in upon the capital, and with each step the court's fear deepened. Richard II emerged at the center of events not because he willed it, but because history thrust him forward. At only 14 years of age, he became the living symbol around which both fear and hope revolved. The lords quarreled among themselves, the rebels gathered by the tens of thousands, and the kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos. But in the middle of this storm stood a boy dressed in royal robes, expected to embody the majesty of England. The chronicles describe him seated upon a throne in Westminster, the weight of a crown pressing down on a head still youthful. The folds of his cloak, heavy with embroidery, seemed almost too large for his shoulders, yet there was something in his bearing, a calmness that belied his years. Those who looked upon him saw not just a child, but the vessel of kingship itself, and in that contradiction lay the fascination of his image, fragile in body, but elevated by the aura of monarchy. The omniscient gaze moves closer. Richard listens as his counselors argue. Some urge him to stay within the safety of the tower. Others insist he must face his people. His eyes, wide but steady, rest on their anxious faces. He does not fully grasp the intricacies of politics, yet he understands instinctively what it means to be king. That in moments of peril, all eyes turn to him, and he cannot shrink away. Outside, the city murmurs with tension. The rebels advance, their banners rising like waves on the horizon. Inside, the boy king is prepared to ride out and meet them. It is a scene of extraordinary contrast, the swelling fury of a people against the quiet resolve of a single youth. He cannot match their strength in arms, but he can offer something else: presence. Richard's image at this moment became more than personal. It became symbolic. For the rebels, he was still a figure of hope, distinct from the corrupt ministers they despised. Many believed that if they could reach him directly, the young king would understand their grievances and deliver justice. For the lords, he was the last bastion of legitimacy, the fragile thread binding a realm that threatened to unravel. For history, he was the embodiment of monarchy at its most vulnerable, yet also at its most necessary. Imagine the cinematic frame: a boy draped in crimson and gold, standing at the edge of a balcony, gazing down upon a city seething with unrest. Behind him hover cautious advisors, but he steps forward, the sun catching the crown upon his brow. In that moment, he appears neither entirely child nor fully man, but something suspended between, a figure caught in the act of becoming. The omniscient narrator reflects, Richard's role in the Peasants' Revolt was less about command than about presence. He did not lead armies or draft decrees. He offered his youth as a canvas upon which both rebels and nobles painted their hopes and fears. That he could stand unflinching before the storm gave the revolt its most enduring image. Thus, as the rebels neared London and the kingdom braced itself, Richard II stood poised at the threshold of history. A boy in royal robes, confronted by forces far greater than himself, yet already carrying the weight of a crown. In his image lay the paradox of the revolt. the might of the many against the frailty of one, in the strange truth that sometimes it is precisely in fragility that kingship finds its power. On the morning of June the 13th, 1381, the Great March reached the gates of London. The city, long the beating heart of the kingdom, had braced itself for the arrival of thousands of rebels from Essex and Kent. Yet when the moment came, the gates did not remain barred. Instead, the doors of London swung open and the multitude poured in. For many of the city's poor inhabitants, apprentices, and day laborers, the rising was not a threat, but a cause to be embraced. Their lives, too, had been shaped by the same burdens, by rents, guild restrictions, and the unequal weight of law. To them, the Irish rebels were not invaders but allies, and so the city became less a fortress against the rising than a stage upon which it would now play its most dramatic scenes. The sight was unlike anything London had witnessed in living memory. Tens of thousands surged into the narrow streets, their banners waving above a sea of heads. The sound of their arrival echoed against the stone walls, shouts, songs, the clatter of feet and tools carried as weapons. Market stalls were abandoned as citizens craned their necks to watch. Some cheered, others watched in silence, but none could deny that the people had taken possession of the city. Among the rebels' targets, one stood above all others: the Savoy Palace, the magnificent residence of John of Gaunt, uncle to the king, and one of the most powerful figures in England. To the marchers, Gaunt embodied the corruption and arrogance of the ruling elite. Though absent at the time, his name was on the lips of the rebels, cursed as a symbol of the injustices they had endured. His palace by the Thames, resplendent with riches and heraldic glory, stood in stark contrast to the humble cottages of those who now gathered before its gates. The omniscient gaze draws us to the moment the crowd descended upon the Savoy. The palace, with its great halls and glittering windows, was more than a residence. It was a statement of power, wealth, and permanence. To the rebels, bringing it low was an act not only of vengeance, but of symbolism. By setting flame to its chambers, they sought to show that no fortress of privilege could withstand the will of the people. Soon smoke began to rise above the city skyline. Flames licked at the fine timbers of the palace, and the air filled with the crackle of fire consuming tapestries, furniture, and the treasures that had once proclaimed Gaunt's might. Londoners watched from across the river, astonished to see a symbol of royal power undone not by foreign enemies, but by the hands of their own countrymen. Yet the destruction of the Savoy was not simple plunder. Chroniclers note that the rebels imposed rules upon themselves. No man was to keep for his own use the riches of the palace. If gold or silver was found, it was cast into the flames or thrown into the river, as though to deny not only Gaunt's wealth, but the very idea of private enrichment by corrupt means. The act was as much ritual as riot, a purging of the old order in symbolic fire. For the rebels, this was liberation made visible. They had entered the capital, received the support of its poor, and struck down the home of the man they most reviled. The old order, so immovable in parchment and law, now seemed vulnerable in stone and timber. For the lords who heard of it, the message was chilling. If even the Savoy could fall, nothing in England was beyond the reach of this rising. The city itself seemed transformed. Streets that had once echoed only to the wheels of merchants' carts now trembled under the tread of the multitude. Fires burned in more than hearths. They burned in the imaginations of common people who, for the first time, saw that authority could be defied within the very heart of the realm. The omniscient narrator reflects, the entry into London was the revolt's great turning point. It was no longer a movement of villages and counties distant from the halls of power. It had come to the capital. It had been welcomed by the poor of the city, and it had struck down one of the greatest symbols of noble privilege. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed reversed, the mighty displaced, the humble ascendant, and a boy king watching from behind walls as his people seized his capital. Thus, on those June days, London became both stage and prize of the revolt. With each gate opened, each cheer from the city's poor, each flame rising from the Savoy, the rebellion proclaimed that the kingdom itself was in question. The peasants and townsfolk had not only entered the city, they had entered history, and history would never forget the sight of their banners streaming above the streets of London. The entry into London was only the beginning. Once the gates had opened and the rebels poured through, the capital of England became a stage for the raw drama of upheaval. For centuries, London had been the seat of law and order, the home of royal courts, the place where parchment and seal carried the force of command. But in those June days of 1381, the foundations trembled. The crowd, numbering tens of thousands, no longer content with symbolic fires, now turned its fury upon the living agents of the system they despised. Judges, lawyers, and clerks, those whose lives were devoted to the machinery of law, found themselves singled out. To the rebels, these men were not neutral servants of justice, but instruments of oppression. The ones who had enforced unfair statutes, upheld the statute of laborers, and recorded the endless debts that chained villagers to their lords. To strike at them was to strike at the very face of the old order. The omniscient gaze lingers on a courthouse where documents once dictated the course of countless lives. Now its walls shook with the cries of a people determined to unmake those decrees. Amid this chaos, men of the law were dragged into the open. Chroniclers record executions, grim spectacles that unfolded in the streets. To the rebels, these were not murders but reckonings, a balancing of scales long tilted against them. Each act was laden with symbolism. The judges who had sentenced poor men now themselves stood condemned by the multitude. The lawyers who had twisted words to defend privilege were silenced by voices they could no longer control. Order was inverted. The ruled judged their rulers. Symbols of authority met a similar fate. Buildings that represented the crown's reach, offices filled with records, and symbols of legal and fiscal power were broken apart. The rebels sought not only to punish individuals, but to dismantle the outward forms of oppression. Seals, ledgers, and emblems of office were destroyed as if to erase the memory of their authority. The omniscient narrator observes, "It was as though the people, denied for centuries the power to speak, had now chosen to speak through destruction. Yet this was not mindless anarchy. Within the tumult, there was method. The rebels moved with intent against those who embodied corruption. They did not sweep randomly through every house. They chose their targets with care. Officials of the exchequer, lawyers of the royal courts, and men tied to hated policies bore the brunt of the people's wrath. It was a moral theater, harsh and uncompromising, designed to demonstrate that the world had turned upside down. The city itself seemed to reel under the transformation. London's narrow streets, usually crowded with merchants and apprentices, now became processional routes for justice of a different kind. Fires smoldered where symbols of authority had stood. Crowds gathered not to hear proclamations from heralds, but to witness the fall of men once untouchable. The atmosphere was heavy with awe as much as with rage. Those who watched sensed they were standing inside a moment when history itself was shifting. For the rebels, this was liberation enacted before their eyes. For the city's elite, it was terror. The boundaries of law had collapsed. The forms of order they had long relied upon no longer carried weight. A judge's robe, once a shield of dignity, now marked its wearer for punishment. The walls of institutions once thought impregnable now offered no protection. The people had become both jury and executioner of the system that bound them. The omniscient narrator reflects, this was the essence of revolt, the sudden collapse of what seemed immovable, the unveiling of power as fragile once the consent of the many was withdrawn. The lawyers, judges, and clerks who had enforced statutes discovered that their authority existed only so long as others believed in it. When that belief was shattered, their words and seals meant nothing. And so, through those days of June, London was caught in a paradox. The capital of law transformed into the capital of chaos. The seat of the old order turned into the theater of its undoing. To some, it was horror. To others, justice. But to all, it was unforgettable. The uprising had revealed the extraordinary truth that even the most entrenched symbols of power could be overturned when the people themselves rose to speak. On June 14, 1381, the revolt reached its first great climax. For days, the rebels had surged through London, burning symbols of privilege, punishing officials, and proclaiming their demands in voices that could no longer be ignored. The city trembled, the nobles quarreled, and the court wavered. At last, there came a moment when the boy king himself could no longer remain hidden. Richard II, only 14 years old, rode out from the Tower to meet his people face to face. The chosen ground was Mile End, a broad field east of the city, where the open sky could bear witness to an extraordinary encounter. There, tens of thousands of rebels waited, a living sea of men and women who had left their villages behind to bring their cause to the heart of England. Their banners fluttered in the summer air, their tools turned weapons glinted under the sun, and their voices rose in a restless murmur. They had come not merely to protest, but to demand a new order. The omniscient gaze lingers on the scene. A boy king on horseback, his cloak heavy with royal embroidery, surrounded by a nervous retinue, riding slowly toward a multitude unlike any monarch had ever faced. On one side stood the symbols of crown and tradition, on the other, the massed strength of the common people. In that moment, all of England seemed suspended between two futures. The rebels pressed forward their demands. They called for an end to serfdom, for the right of free men to labor where they chose, and for wages to be agreed rather than imposed. They demanded the abolition of oppressive taxes, the dismissal of corrupt officials, and a general pardon for all who had taken part in the rising. Some even called for deeper reforms, for a world in which lords would no longer hold dominion over men, and where the law would serve the poor as much as the rich. Richard listened, his youthful face solemn. He could not have failed to grasp the danger of the moment. Before him stood a crowd that outnumbered any force his nobles could summon, but he also understood instinctively the power of words and presence. With a clear voice, he spoke promises that astonished both his followers and his enemies. He declared that the bonds of serfdom would be broken, that all men should be free. He promised charters of liberty, a general pardon, and reforms to ease the burdens of the people. The effect was electric. A murmur swept through the multitude, then swelled into cries of joy. For generations, peasants had bowed before lords, knowing their place was fixed by birth and law. Now, from the lips of their king, came the assurance that those chains would be struck away. Many fell to their knees in reverence, not to their lords, but to a monarch who seemed, at last, to speak for them. The field of Mile End resounded with hope, as if a new England had suddenly appeared on the horizon. The omniscient narrator reflects. In that instant, Richard II became more than a symbol of fragile youth. He became the vessel of promise. To the rebels, he was not the enemy, but the ally. A boy king, uncorrupted by the greed of courtiers, ready to deliver justice. His words, whether spoken from conviction or necessity, carried the weight of transformation. He gave the people what they longed for most, not gold or power, but recognition of their dignity. Yet beneath this vision lay uncertainty. Could a 14-year-old truly deliver what he promised? Could charters written in the heat of revolt endure once the flames had cooled? In the eyes of many rebels, these questions did not matter. What mattered was that, for the first time, they had stood before their king, spoken their demands, and heard assent. Hope filled the air as tangibly as the smoke of recent fires. Thus, Mile End became a turning point. It was the high-water mark of the Peasants' Revolt, a moment when king and people seemed briefly united, when the possibility of a remade society shimmered in the summer sun. The rebels dispersed that evening with charters in hand and confidence in their hearts, believing that the England they dreamed of was within reach. But the omniscient gaze, stretching beyond that moment, perceives the tension still unresolved. For promises once spoken can be as fragile as parchment in the rain, and even as the people cheered their king, others within the court whispered of retribution. The stage was set for triumph, but also for betrayal. For now, though, the field of Mile End belonged to the people, and their voices rose in jubilation around a boy who seemed, for one brief day, to embody their cause. The meeting at Mile End left behind not only charters and promises, but also an image, one so vivid that it would linger in memory long after the revolt itself was crushed. On that summer day in 1381, a boy of 14 rode calmly through a sea of people who had overturned the order of the kingdom. His cloak shimmered in the sunlight, the crown upon his head glinting like a fragile halo, and his youthful face, composed and steady, seemed to radiate assurance far beyond his years. The omniscient gaze captures the scene in cinematic clarity. Richard II's horse moves slowly through the throng, its hooves muffled by the packed earth. Around him stretches the multitude, tens of thousands of villagers and townsfolk, their banners fluttering in the breeze, their rough tools raised in salute. They do not jeer or threaten. Instead, they erupt in cheers, clapping hands, calling blessings upon their king. For the first time, many believe they have been truly seen by the crown. The boy at the center of this vast tableau does not flinch. His eyes meet those of the people nearest to him. His lips part in quiet words of reassurance. Though scarcely more than a child, he plays the role of monarch with instinctive grace. His very presence becomes a promise, a sign that the old walls between king and commons might yet be broken. The distance that had always separated throne from plow, court from cottage, seems for a fleeting moment to vanish. The omniscient narrator reflects, this was the revolt's most luminous hour, the point at which hope became flesh and blood. Richard II was no seasoned statesman, no hardened general, yet in his youth lay a kind of purity. The people could project upon him their dream of a just ruler, uncorrupted by the habits of power. His calmness amid the sea of faces gave the impression that he too was carried along by a vision of renewal. The cheers rolled like waves across the field, voices blending into a chorus that made the very air vibrate. To the rebels, it was not simply the sound of loyalty, but of transformation. They felt themselves part of a kingdom remade, their cause sanctified by the presence of the sovereign himself. In that radiant moment, the boundaries of society seemed less rigid, the promise of freedom less distant. Imagine the frame as though it were painted upon history's canvas. A boy king, riding tall, banners snapping in the wind, villagers pressing close, hands raised in acclamation. Sunlight gleams off the crown, but it is the faces of the people that shine brightest, faces lit with hope, trust, and the conviction that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. Thus, the revolt, for all its turbulence, reached its cinematic height, not in fire or destruction, but in a vision of unity. King and commons, for one suspended instant, seemed bound together by a covenant of trust. And though the promises would soon falter, though betrayal and suppression lay ahead, that moment endured in memory, a fragile yet unforgettable glimpse of what England might have been. On June 15th, 1381, the rising reached its most dramatic confrontation. The field of Mile End had given the rebels charters and promises, but it had not resolved the deeper questions. Many among the commons still doubted whether words alone could break centuries of bondage. They wanted not only assurances, but proof that their vision of freedom would endure. And so, the movement pressed onward to Smithfield, a broad open space just outside the walls of London, where the final meeting between crown and people would take place. There, amid the gathering crowds, two figures came face to face. Richard II, boy king of 14, and Wat Tyler, the leader who had risen from the people to become their voice. Around them stood thousands, waiting in tense silence, aware that history itself seemed to balance on this exchange. The omniscient gaze lingers on the moment. Richard mounted on his horse, bearing the calm dignity of monarchy, though still youthful in frame. Tyler, confident and direct, advanced to speak for the multitude behind him. His words, though simple, carried the weight of the people's anger and their hopes. He demanded not half measures, but transformation, the complete end of serfdom, freedom of labor, fair rents, and the removal of corrupt officials who had drained the land. Some chronicles suggest he went further, hinting at a leveling of all ranks, a society in which lords would no longer hold sway over commoners. The king listened, his young face composed, but those around him, nobles, knights, and counselors, shifted uneasily. To them, Tyler's demands were not only bold, but dangerous, a challenge to the very foundation of feudal order. Yet Tyler did not soften his tone. He spoke not as a supplicant, but as an equal, addressing the crown with the authority of a man who knew thousands stood at his back. The exchange was stark, a collision of worlds. On one side stood monarchy, clothed in tradition, still fragile in the hands of a boy. On the other stood rebellion, embodied in a craftsman-turned-leader, his voice amplified by the multitude that surged behind him. It was as if two Englands faced one another, one rooted in hierarchy and precedent, the other daring to imagine equality and reform. The atmosphere grew taut. Chroniclers record that Tyler's manner was bold, even defiant, gestures sharp, voice raised, his presence commanding the space between king and people. He did not bow low nor temper his speech. For him, this was the moment to seize recognition, to show that the Commons could stand eye to eye with the Crown. Richard's calm replies, though polite, could not disguise the tension that rippled through the gathering. The boy king assured the rebels once more of charters and freedoms, yet the lords at his side looked on with suspicion, fearing the precedent such concessions might set. In their eyes, Tyler was not only demanding liberty, but undermining their very existence as a class. The omniscient narrator reflects, this encounter at Smithfield was more than negotiation. It was theater, heavy with symbolism. A youth clothed in royal robes confronted a man of the people clothed in plain garb, each embodying a different vision of England's future. The silence of the multitude, the guarded stares of the nobility, and the calm poise of Richard all heightened the sense that the realm itself trembled between old order and new. For the Commons, Tyler's courage was a revelation. Here was one of their own speaking directly to the king, not in whispers or petitions, but in open defiance. For the lords, his audacity was intolerable, a reminder that once the barrier of fear was broken, no privilege was safe. Thus Smithfield became the stage upon which the revolt reached its peak of tension. The boy king and the rebel leader stood in stark opposition, their words carrying the weight of England's destiny. No matter the outcome, the image of that meeting, Richard calm upon his horse, Tyler fiery in his defiance, the crowd pressing close, would linger as the defining moment of the Peasants' Revolt. It was the instant when hope and fear collided, when the voice of the people dared to speak directly to power, and when the fate of the rising hung upon a fragile thread of words. At Smithfield, where words had carried the weight of nations, the tension finally snapped. The meeting between Richard II and Wat Tyler, already charged with peril, reached a breaking point in an instant that neither side could control. Chroniclers tell us that Tyler, emboldened by the multitude at his back, pressed his demands with a boldness that unsettled the royal party. His gestures were sharp, his voice unwavering, his presence too commanding for the nobles who ringed the boy king. Among them stood William Walworth, the mayor of London, a man loyal to the crown and fiercely protective of the city's order. Watching Tyler speak as though king and commoner were equals was more than he could bear. In the sudden flash of a moment, Walworth struck, steel met flesh, and the leader of the Commons fell. The omniscient gaze lingers on the scene as if it were painted in light and shadow. Tyler, the craftsman-turned-leader, collapses in the dust of Smithfield, the sun still glinting on his weapon. Around him thousands stand in stunned silence. For a heartbeat, time itself seems suspended. The man who had carried their cause, who had spoken their anger and their dreams directly to the king, lay motionless. A murmur ripples through the crowd, confusion mingling with outrage. The nobles stiffen, fearful of what the multitude might do. Any spark could ignite chaos. Richard II, scarcely more than a boy, finds himself suddenly at the very center of danger. His counselors panic, imagining the wrath of tens of thousands descending upon them. But the king, whether by instinct or destiny, rides forward. In a voice clear and steady, Richard calls out to the people, "Follow me! I am your captain and your king." The words echo across Smithfield, startling rebels and courtiers alike. For the Commons, it is as if the voice of monarchy itself has reached across the gulf left by Tyler's fall. For the royal party, it is the moment in which the young king saves not only his own life, but the fragile thread of order. The crowd wavers. Some press forward in anger, others fall back in uncertainty. They look to Richard, still mounted, still calm, as if to decide whether their rebellion lives or dies with Tyler. And in that indecision, the revolt loses its edge. The boy king, who moments earlier seemed a prisoner of events, now appears as their master. The omniscient narrator reflects, Tyler's death was more than the loss of a man. It was the breaking of the revolt's heart. For in him the people had found not only a commander, but a symbol, one who dared to stand eye to eye with the crown. His sudden fall left them leaderless at the very moment when leadership mattered most. The cinematic image endures. The wide field of Smithfield filled with tens of thousands, the body of their leader on the ground, the nobles tense with fear, and a boy king holding his horse steady, projecting a calm that belied his years. In that tableau, the revolt reached both its peak and its undoing. Hope and defiance collided with the reality of power, and in a single stroke, the tide began to turn. Thus, the death of Wat Tyler marked the hinge of the Peasants' Revolt. From that moment on, the energy of the rising ebbed. The people still hoped, still believed in the promises spoken at Mile End, but the loss of their leader and the bold intervention of the king shifted the balance. Smithfield, once filled with the roar of demands, was left with silence, broken only by the voice of a boy who claimed the mantle of authority. And in that silence, the destiny of the revolt was sealed. The death of Wat Tyler at Smithfield sent a shockwave through the multitude. For days they had marched under his direction, hearing him speak with the authority of one who dared to look the king in the eye. He had been their compass, their voice, their embodiment of defiance, and now, in an instant, he was gone. The field that only moments before had resounded with the power of their demands fell into a silence broken only by the restless shifting of thousands who no longer knew what to do. The omniscient gaze captures the confusion as it spreads. Men glance at one another, seeking leadership where none remains. The charters promised at Mile End still weigh in their memories, but without Tyler's presence, the assurances seem less certain. The boy king sits tall upon his horse, calm and resolute, while behind him stand lords and knights who have found renewed confidence in the fall of their enemy. The people feel the balance shift, as if the invisible thread that had bound them together has suddenly snapped. Richard II seizes the moment. With a voice remarkably steady for one so young, he rides forward and speaks again to the crowd. He promises them safety if they disperse, mercy if they return to their homes. He assures them that the reforms will be honored, that freedom will come, that the king himself will see to their welfare. His words, carried across Smithfield, fall upon ears eager for reassurance. After the shock of Tyler's death, the people cling to the promise of the monarch, just as they had at Mile End. And so, the tide begins to ebb. What was once a flood of fury starts to trickle back into uncertainty. Some small groups, distrustful, linger, debating whether to stand their ground. Others, fearful of the armed knights at the king's side, begin to drift away. Still others, weary from days of marching and unrest, seize upon the chance to go home. The vast unity that had carried the rebels into London dissolves into fragments. The omniscient narrator reflects, the strength of the revolt had always been its togetherness. Villages that had once stood apart had joined into a single body, tens of thousands moving as one. That togetherness gave them courage, made them believe they could overturn the order of centuries. But with Tyler's fall, that body was broken. Without the unifying voice of their leader, each man and woman was left to their own doubts. Unity gave way to hesitation. Hesitation gave way to retreat. Scenes unfold across the city and countryside. Rebels who only a day before had cheered the king now shuffle out of London's gates, their banners lowered, their tools once brandished, now hanging limp at their sides. Some carry the charters they had been given, clutching them as tokens of a new future. Others, less certain, mutter among themselves that the promises may yet prove false. But for now, the energy of the rising dissipates into exhaustion. London itself breathes a cautious sigh. Merchants reopen their shops, citizens peek from their doors, and nobles whisper relief. The fires that had blazed in the city begin to cool. Order, fragile though it is, returns. And yet, the silence that follows is heavy, for all know that the hopes raised at Mile End and echoed at Smithfield will soon be tested. From above, the image is striking. The field of Smithfield, once alive with the roar of tens of thousands, slowly empties. The boy king remains in the saddle, a figure of unexpected authority, while the people stream away in every direction. The rebellion, so vast and powerful in its momentum, now unravels into scattered trails of weary marchers returning to their villages. The omniscient narrator contemplates the paradox. The revolt had reached the very heart of power, had shaken the foundations of England, had forced its king to make promises. Yet at the very moment of triumph, it slipped away. Leadership lost, unity fractured. The commons discovered that their strength could dissipate as quickly as it had formed. Hope lingered, but without structure it could not endure. Thus the great rising began to fade, not with a final battle, but with a slow, uncertain dispersal. The people left London with promises in their hands and doubts in their hearts. Some believed they had won a victory, others suspected betrayal, but all knew that the moment of their greatest unity was past. The tide that had surged so high now ebbed back into the fields and villages from which it had come, leaving behind not only ashes and memories, but also the haunting sense of what might have been. When the fields of Smithfield had emptied and the vast host of peasants had begun their weary journeys back to village and farm, the crown moved swiftly to reclaim what had been shaken. For a few brief days, it had seemed as though the kingdom itself might be remade. But once the unity of the rising collapsed, the monarchy and nobility seized the chance to reassert their power. The promises spoken at Mile End dissolved into memory, replaced by the iron resolve of rulers determined to stamp out the embers of rebellion. Richard II, still only 14 but emboldened by his narrow escape, became the face of the counterstroke. He had looked into the eyes of his subjects, had promised them freedom, and had held their trust for a fleeting moment. Now he declared with firmness that those promises had been made under duress, that the bonds of obedience still held, and that law must be restored. His words, carried by royal messengers into every shire, announced that mercy would no longer be the policy of the realm. The omniscient gaze spreads across England in the weeks that followed. In Essex, Kent, Suffolk, Norfolk, and beyond, the king's justices and the lord's retainers began their work. Villages that had risen together now saw armed bands of royal officers arrive with writs of arrest. Men who had marched to London in hope were seized in their fields, brought before hastily convened tribunals, and condemned as traitors to the crown. Chroniclers speak of thousands punished, the scale of reprisal as wide as the rebellion itself. One by one, the leaders of the rising were hunted down. Some fled into hiding, seeking shelter with sympathizers, only to be betrayed or discovered. Others surrendered in the belief that the king's earlier promise of pardon might still shield them. But Richard and his council had resolved otherwise. This was to be a reckoning, a demonstration that the authority of lords and monarchy could not be challenged without dire consequence. Among the most famous of all was John Ball, the radical priest whose sermons had lit the imagination of the commons. For years he had spoken of equality before God, of a world where lords held no dominion over peasants, where the words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" rang as a cry of justice. His capture became a priority for the regime. When he was finally taken, he was brought to trial, not simply as a rebel, but as a dangerous heretic who had dared to undermine the very order of Christendom. The omniscient gaze lingers on the scene of his sentencing. Ball, gaunt but unyielding, stood before the court of lords who had long feared his words. They condemned him to death, declaring that his teachings had stirred the people to insolence and disobedience. Yet even at the last, chroniclers record that his voice remained strong, affirming that the struggle for justice had not been in vain. His end was meant to silence, but instead it ensured that his name would be remembered as the conscience of the revolt. Across England, the reprisals continued with grim regularity. Gallows rose in towns where rebels had gathered, and justice was carried out in marketplaces before the eyes of assembled crowds. Each act of punishment was not merely retribution, but a lesson, a reminder of the price of defiance. The monarchy's message was clear. Obedience was restored, the bonds of feudal order reinforced, and the dream of freedom extinguished by fear. The omniscient narrator reflects, this was the paradox of the revolt's aftermath. The people had risen to demand liberty, had forced their king to speak of freedom, and had glimpsed for a moment the possibility of a different England. Yet in defeat, they endured not only the return of the old burdens, but also the tightening of chains. The very act of rising had exposed their strength, and for that, they were punished with severity meant to erase the memory of their defiance. And yet memory cannot be so easily erased. Though the fields once more filled with laborers, though rents were collected and dues enforced, the words of John Ball lingered. Though Richard II declared serfdom intact, the spirit of rebellion had left its mark. The revolt had failed in its immediate aims, but in its echo lay the seed of questions that could not be silenced. Thus, the royal counterstroke closed the chapter of the Great Rising. England's rulers reasserted their dominion through fear and punishment, while the commons returned to their villages chastened but not entirely defeated in spirit. The flames of rebellion had been doused, but the smoke lingered in memory. The kingdom stood restored to its old order, yet never again would it seem quite so unshakable. For in 1381 the people had shown that even the humblest could rise to challenge the mighty, and though crushed, that truth would remain. The aftermath of the revolt revealed the full measure of royal duplicity. At Mile End, Richard II had spoken words that shimmered like sunlight through storm clouds: freedom for the serfs, forgiveness for the rebels, and reform that promised to ease the burdens of the commons. At Smithfield, his calm voice had steadied a crowd on the verge of violence, persuading them to disperse with charters of liberty clutched in their hands. But once the peasants had scattered, once their leaders had fallen, and once the power of the crown had reasserted itself, those promises dissolved like mist in the morning. The omniscient gaze moves to Westminster, where the young king and his council deliberated in the days following the rebellion's collapse. Surrounded by lords and prelates, Richard declared that the concessions made under duress were void. The charters issued to the people were torn up, their seals broken, their pledges discarded. Serfdom, he proclaimed, remained as it always had been. The obligations of villains to their lords, the rents, the dues, the restrictions of labor, all stood firm. The promises of Mile End were nothing more than expedients, tools of survival in a moment of peril. For the nobility, this reversal was a relief. The specter of equality, raised for a brief instant, had terrified them. To imagine a world in which peasants were free to choose their masters, to bargain their wages, to abandon the duties of villeinage, was to imagine the collapse of their estates and their fortunes. Now, with the king's repudiation, they breathed easier. Authority was restored, hierarchy reaffirmed, the old order seemingly eternal once more. But for the people, the betrayal was bitter. In villages across England, men returned home with charters they had carried proudly, only to discover that they were worthless scraps of parchment. Some had believed that history itself had changed, that they had witnessed the dawn of a new age. Instead, they found the same overseers, the same demands, the same burdens that had driven them to rise. Worse still, the punishments that followed the revolt left scars far deeper than before. Families mourned lost fathers and brothers. Villages remembered gallows erected in their squares, and all were forced to live with the knowledge that their king's promises could not be trusted. The omniscient narrator reflects, in Richard II's betrayal lies one of the enduring tragedies of the revolt. The boy who had inspired hope with his words now revealed himself as a monarch schooled in the hard lessons of power. His calmness at Mile End had not been the sign of a reformer's spirit, but the mask of survival. He had said what he needed to say to diffuse the storm, and once safe, he withdrew every word. Symbolically, this moment mattered as much as the revolt itself. For centuries, the people of England would remember not only their rising, but the betrayal that followed. They had seen how promises could be made to the multitude and then revoked in the safety of council chambers. They had learned that royal words, however soothing in the heat of crisis, could be as fragile as the parchment upon which they were written. Cinematically, one might imagine Richard standing before his council, the boy king with solemn eyes, declaring that all concessions were void. Around him, nobles nod with approval, the seals of charters broken and tossed aside. Beyond the chamber walls, the peasants toil once more in the fields, their brief glimpse of freedom receding into memory. The contrast is stark. The grandeur of Westminster against the silent endurance of the villages, the permanence of privilege against the fragility of hope. Yet even as Richard restored the old order, something had changed. The revolt, though crushed, had revealed the power of collective action. The commons had shown that they could shake the kingdom, force the monarch to parley, and for a moment make the mighty tremble. Though betrayed, they carried away a memory that could not be erased, that the structures of power were not immutable, that kings and lords could be challenged. Thus, in 1381, Richard II both saved and doomed himself. He saved his crown by retracting the promises of freedom, reassuring the nobility that their privileges were intact. but he doomed his legacy by staining it with betrayal. The revolt ended in silence. The charters burned, the people subdued. Yet beneath the surface of England's fields and villages, the memory of broken promises lingered. The monarchy had preserved its authority, but it had also planted seeds of mistrust that would echo across generations. The omniscient narrator concludes, the revolt of the peasants had not remade the kingdom, but it had exposed its fault lines. Richard II's words at Mile End lifted hopes. His reversal at Westminster crushed them. And in that cycle of promise and betrayal lay the enduring lesson of 1381, that power could bend under pressure, but would snap back with vengeance, and that in the struggle between ruler and ruled, trust once broken could never be wholly restored. The Great Rising of 1381 ended not with the birth of a new world, but with the restoration of the old. The vast energy that had carried tens of thousands from the fields of Essex and Kent to the heart of London dispersed like smoke in the wind. Leaders were executed, charters revoked, and the bold visions of equality proclaimed by John Ball and Wat Tyler collapsed under the weight of reprisals. For all their courage, the peasants stood at the close of the revolt, much as they had at its beginning, bound by the obligations of serfdom, hemmed in by the authority of lords, and constrained by laws written to preserve the privileges of the few. The omniscient gaze moves across England in the months after the rebellion. In village after village, life resumed under the familiar rhythms of feudal order. The villain still owed his lord days of labor on the domain. The reeve still collected dues and enforced manorial customs. The statute of laborers still dictated wages and bound men to the soil. The dream that for a moment had seemed tangible, that the shackles of serfdom might be cast off in one decisive stroke, was shattered. Hope gave way to resignation, and resignation settled again into the weary routines of rural life. Yet those routines were now shadowed by memory. For the peasants, the revolt had been more than a failure of arms. It was a failure of expectation. They had believed the word of the king at Mile End, had carried home charters that promised freedom, and had seen themselves reflected in the possibility of a remade England. To discover those promises revoked was a bitter humiliation. The monarchy's betrayal cut more deeply than defeat in battle, for it revealed the chasm between what the people longed for and what their rulers were willing to grant. In Westminster and noble halls across the kingdom, there was relief. The rising had been terrifying, a vision of the world turned upside down. But with its suppression, lords reassured themselves that hierarchy still held, that peasants still bent their backs, that the structures of privilege remained firm. The revolt in their eyes had proven not the strength of the commons, but their weakness, their inability to sustain rebellion once leadership was broken. Serfdom endured, rents were collected, and the countryside returned to its accustomed silence. The omniscient narrator reflects, in the immediate sense, the revolt was a failure. It achieved none of its boldest aims. The poll tax was not abolished for good, but replaced with other levies. The hated statute of laborers remained in force. Serfdom, that ancient chain linking man to land and lord, survived for another generation. No sweeping reform of law or society followed in its wake. Instead, the rebellion was remembered by the powerful as a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when the commons forgot their place. Cinematically, one might imagine the fields once more filled with peasants stooped over their work, the manor house looming above as it always had, the village reeve counting rents with the same old authority. The banners that had once streamed above London streets now lay discarded, and the voices that had chanted for freedom were reduced again to murmurs over hearth fires. The dream had receded, leaving only the endurance of daily toil, and yet the very failure of the revolt cast its shadow forward, for in failing, it revealed the limits of peasant power in the 14th century. United, they could shake the realm. Divided, they could achieve nothing lasting. The monarchy and nobility had proven too entrenched, their control over armies, laws, and resources too strong to be overturned in a single rising. The commons had glimpsed the possibility of change, but they lacked the means to make it permanent. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt ended as so many uprisings have throughout history, with punishment, disappointment, and the reaffirmation of the status quo. Its immediate legacy was silence. Fields plowed, rents paid, customs enforced. The bold words of John Ball faded into memory. The vision of Wat Tyler lay buried at Smithfield, and the boy king who had once promised freedom emerged as the guardian of order. In every practical sense, the peasants had failed. But the omniscient voice adds a final reflection. Failure is never simple. For though serfdom endured, though rents and dues were still collected, though the commons returned to their toil, the memory of 1381 could not be erased. The revolt did not destroy the old order, but it revealed its cracks. And in those cracks lay the seeds of a different future, though it would take generations to bear fruit. In the immediate aftermath, however, only one truth was clear. The peasants had risen, they had dared, and they had been cast down. The bonds of servitude remained, and the dream of freedom was once again deferred. The Peasants' Revolt, though crushed in its immediate aims, left behind echoes that outlasted the gallows and the broken charters. It was, in its own way, a spark that illuminated questions England had long avoided asking. Who should bear the burdens of war and taxation? Why should one man be bound in servitude while another held dominion by birth? Could law serve not only the powerful, but also the weak? In 1381, these questions were not answered, but they were asked with a force that made it impossible to forget them. The omniscient gaze looks forward, across the 15th century, to the gradual fading of serfdom. In the immediate aftermath of the revolt, lords clung desperately to the bonds of villanage, enforcing them with renewed vigor. Yet the economic tides of England moved in ways no decree could fully control. The Black Death had already thinned the population, giving laborers greater leverage. The demand for wages continued to grow, and the statute of laborers, though harshly enforced, proved impossible to uphold in practice. Slowly, decade by decade, the obligations of serfdom loosened. By the middle of the 15th century, villenage had withered in much of England, not by royal gift, but by economic necessity. The revolt did not cause the end of serfdom, but it hastened its moral demise. After 1381, the legitimacy of binding men to land was forever in doubt. The commons had proclaimed, however briefly, that freedom was their right, not their privilege. Even though power restored the old order, conscience had been stirred. No lord could forget that peasants had once demanded liberty on the fields of Essex and Kent. And no peasant could forget that the demand had been spoken in the face of a king. The memory lingered like an ember, faint but unextinguished. In the broader arc of English history, the revolt became part of a tradition not of victory, but of resistance. When later generations rose to question royal authority, when Parliament asserted its rights against the crown, when reformers preached of liberty and conscience, the shadow of 1381 hovered in the background. Chroniclers of the 15th and 16th centuries spoke of the Great Rising with a mixture of horror and fascination as both a warning of disorder and a reminder of the people's voice. Cinematically, one might imagine the scene shifting through time, the gallows of 1381 fading into the quiet fields of the 15th century, where peasants now work as free tenants rather than bound villains. The manor house still stands, but its grasp upon the village is weaker. The lords still collect rents, but no longer command the absolute obedience of serfdom. Across the centuries, the voices of John Ball and Wat Tyler echo faintly, their words resurfacing whenever questions of justice and liberty rise again. The omniscient narrator reflects. The revolt's long-term legacy lay not in immediate change, but in the transformation of imagination. It revealed that common men and women could think of themselves as political actors, that they could claim rights, that they could envision a different order of society. Once that vision was spoken, it could not be unspoken. It might be silenced, mocked, punished, but it would return in sermons, in ballads, in whispered conversations by the fire. England had heard the idea of equality, and though it would take centuries to flower, the seed had been planted. By the 15th century, the decline of serfdom was evident. The bonds of villenage were commuted into money rents. Peasants became tenants rather than property. Lords increasingly relied on contracts rather than coercion. The rebellion had failed to win freedom in the moment, but the tide of history moved toward it nonetheless. What had been demanded in anger at Smithfield slowly unfolded as reality across the English countryside. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt occupies a paradoxical place in history. As an uprising, it failed. As a moment of transformation, it succeeded. It did not topple kings, but it reshaped the horizon of possibility. It left scars of fear in the nobility, but also a memory of power in the commons. It reminded England that beneath the weight of custom and privilege lay the restless question of justice, a question that could be silenced but never erased. And so the omniscient voice concludes, the revolt of 1381 was both defeat and beginning. In its ashes lay the persistence of serfdom, but also the birth of a tradition of resistance that would echo through English history. Each generation would hear it differently, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as an inspiration, but always as a reminder that even the lowliest had once risen to ask, why should the world be as it is, and why should it not be otherwise? In the centuries that followed, the Peasants' Revolt lived on not only in memory, but in the shifting narratives of history and culture. What had begun as a desperate rising against taxation and bondage became, in the telling, something far larger, a story of justice and betrayal, of voices silenced and voices remembered. Figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, once condemned as traitors, began to reappear as symbols of defiance, and their legacy traveled far beyond the fields of Essex and Kent. The omniscient gaze surveys the long line of chronicles and commentaries that grappled with 1381. Medieval clerics often described the rising with fear and contempt, calling it a monstrous upheaval, a moment when the natural order seemed inverted. To them, Wat Tyler was no hero but a dangerous disruptor, a man who dared to look a king in the eye without bowing. John Ball, in their pages, was not a prophet of equality, but a heretic whose words had poisoned the commons with insolence. The revolt, for such writers, was a nightmare to be remembered as warning. Yet even in these condemnations, something slipped through, a recognition of the people's power. Chroniclers could not deny that the revolt had shaken England to its core, that tens of thousands had marched on London, that the king himself had been compelled to parley. Their horror was also a testimony to the magnitude of what had occurred. As centuries passed, interpretations shifted. By the early modern period, scholars and reformers began to revisit 1381 with more sympathy. The radical preacher John Ball, once vilified, was remembered for his famous words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" To some, these were not words of rebellion, but of truth, a reminder that inequality was neither natural nor divine. Wat Tyler, too, was gradually reimagined, not simply as a rebel cut down at Smithfield, but as a leader who had dared to speak for the voiceless. Historians long debated the meaning of the revolt. Was it a social revolution, a conscious attempt to overturn the very structures of feudal society? Or was it rather a spontaneous eruption of anger, fueled by taxation and the strains of war, without coherent vision for the future? Some argued that its demands, freedom from serfdom, fair rents, the removal of corrupt officials, were revolutionary in their essence. Others insisted it was less a revolution than a desperate plea for relief, a temporary storm rather than a blueprint for change. The omniscient narrator reflects, "This debate itself is part of the revolt's legacy, for in every generation scholars have seen in 1381 not only what happened, but what they needed it to mean. To Victorians, it was a lesson in the dangers of mob rule. To 20th century historians, it could be framed as the first stirring of class consciousness. To modern readers, it may seem both. A revolt born of immediate grievances yet carrying the seeds of a broader vision. Culturally, the revolt has inspired poets, playwrights, and artists. In the 16th and 17th centuries, ballads circulated retelling the deeds of Tyler and Ball, sometimes with pity, sometimes with admiration. Later writers, from the Romantic poets to socialist thinkers, found in 1381 a fertile ground for imagination. The painter's canvas has shown John Ball preaching by firelight, his gaunt figure illuminated as villagers listen in rapture. The dramatist has staged Wat Tyler's defiance before the king, turning the marketplace of Smithfield into a theater of justice. The poet has seized upon the famous lines of Ball as a refrain of equality, ringing across time. Cinematically, one might envision history itself as a gallery, its walls lined with shifting portraits of the rebels. In one, they are monstrous and disorderly, a crowd threatening the peace of the realm. In another, they are noble and oppressed, the forerunners of freedom. In yet another, they are complex and human, caught between desperation and hope. Each portrait says less about 1381 than about the era that painted it. The omniscient voice concludes, "The Peasants' Revolt is not only a chapter of medieval history, but a mirror in which later ages have seen their own struggles." Wat Tyler and John Ball became more than men. They became symbols, endlessly reshaped. For some, they warned of chaos. For others, they promised justice. And so, the revolt lived on in books, songs, paintings, and debates. Its failure as an uprising transformed into success as a story, one that refused to die. Thus, the cultural afterlife of 1381 endures. It reminds us that revolts are not measured only by what they achieve in the moment, but by the meanings they gather in memory. The peasants of England did not win their freedom in 1381, but they won something else, a place in the imagination of a nation, a presence in its debates over justice and equality, and a voice that, though once silenced, continues to echo across the centuries. The Great Rising of 1381 ended not with triumph, but with silence, a silence heavy with betrayal and disappointment. The peasants who had marched from the fields of Essex and Kent into the heart of London had glimpsed a future they thought could be theirs. They had heard their king promise them liberty, had carried home charters that seemed to seal their freedom, and had dared to imagine an England where the bonds of servitude might finally be broken. Yet, as the revolt collapsed, as Wat Tyler lay dead at Smithfield and John Ball awaited his trial, those promises dissolved like mist under the morning sun. The old order reasserted itself with a vengeance, and the peasants, scattered back into their villages, found themselves once more under the burdens they had briefly shaken off. And yet, though the revolt failed in practice, it endured in memory, leaving behind a legacy that would shape England's imagination for centuries. The memory of 1381 lingered first as bitterness. Villages that had sent their men to London carried home not only scraps of broken charters, but stories of betrayal. Fathers and sons spoke in low voices of how they had seen the boy king smile and promise freedom, only to withdraw those words once he was safe among his lords. The gallows erected in market squares reminded them of the price of defiance, yet also bore witness to the fact that their voices had been powerful enough to frighten the mighty. To the nobility, the revolt was a nightmare to be recounted with horror. To the commons, it was a painful memory, but also a reminder that the world could be shaken. The revolt did not end serfdom in its day. The villain still owed his lord labor on the domain, still paid his dues, still found his wages restricted by laws that clung stubbornly to the statute of laborers. The manor reeve still stood as the daily face of authority, tallying rents and enforcing custom. Yet something had shifted, not in law, but in conscience. The demands of 1381 had declared openly that men wished to be free, that they believed their work should be their own, their lives not chained by birth. For the first time, this longing for liberty had been spoken not in whispers, but in the open field, in the ear of the king himself. That truth could not be erased. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, serfdom began slowly to fade, not by decree, not as a gift from lords or crown, but as an outcome of changing times. The Black Death had thinned England's population, giving laborers more leverage. Lords who tried to enforce villanage often found it easier to commute services into money rents, and money rents gradually gave peasants more freedom to move and negotiate. By the mid-15th century, in many places, villanage had withered, leaving behind a countryside increasingly composed of tenants rather than serfs. The revolt of 1381 had not created this transformation, but it had hastened its moral inevitability. After the commons had proclaimed their demand for freedom so loudly, it was harder than ever to justify keeping them bound. The omniscient eye lingers on this paradox. The peasants had failed to win in the moment, but history moved slowly in their favor. Their revolt was remembered as a cautionary tale by lords, but also as a seed of possibility by the people. Wat Tyler and John Ball became symbols larger than their lives. Tyler, slain at Smithfield, came to embody the commoner who dares to stand equal before the crown. Ball condemned as a heretic, became the prophet, whose sermon still rings across centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Their names lingered in chronicles and songs, in whispered stories, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as inspirations, always as reminders. Historians, too, could never quite agree on how to read the revolt. Some wrote of it as a monstrous eruption, a moment when the natural order turned upside down, when peasants forgot their place and chaos threatened the realm. Others, centuries later, began to see it as the first stirring of social revolution, the commons proclaiming ideas of equality before they had language to frame them. Was it a revolution or merely a protest? Was it a conscious attempt to reorder society or a desperate outburst against taxes and war? The debate itself became part of the revolt's afterlife, each age interpreting 1381 in the light of its own concerns. In culture, the revolt refused to die. Ballads in later centuries retold the story of Tyler's defiance. Painters imagined John Ball preaching by the flicker of torchlight. Villagers huddled in awe around his gaunt figure. Playwrights placed the meeting at Smithfield on the stage, dramatizing the clash of commoner and king. Poets echoed the lines of Ball as if they were timeless proverbs. Each retelling reshaped the meaning of the revolt, but each kept it alive. To some, the rebels were villains who had brought disorder. To others, martyrs who had died for justice. Their story became not only history but myth, and in myth it found its enduring strength. The revolt also left behind a tradition of resistance. Later risings, from Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450 to the great conflicts of the 17th century, carried echoes of 1381. The memory that peasants had once risen to challenge the crown lingered in the national consciousness, a precedent that later generations could draw upon. When Parliament fought against Charles I, when reformers in later centuries preached of liberty and conscience, they stood in a tradition that, however indirectly, stretched back to the fields of Essex and Kent. The revolt had not toppled a throne, but it had reminded England that thrones could be shaken. The omniscient narrator reflects that the revolt's most enduring contribution was its place in imagination. For the first time, ordinary men and women appeared not only as background figures in chronicles, but as actors on the stage of history. Their voices, though suppressed, could not be erased. Their demands, though denied, became part of the story of England, a story that belonged not only to kings and nobles, but to plowmen and weavers. The rising showed that justice was not merely a gift from above, but a claim from below. And so, though the revolt ended in defeat, it endured as symbol. Its failure became its paradoxical strength, for in failure it remained unfulfilled, a dream deferred, waiting for later generations to pick it up. Each time the people of England questioned authority, each time they spoke of rights and freedoms, the memory of 1381 stirred faintly in the background. The story ends not in London, but in the countryside. The camera of history drifts outward, away from Westminster and Smithfield, across the rolling fields of England. There, peasants bend again to their plows, oxen pulling steadily through the soil. The manor house still looms above, its shadow long, but in the furrows lies another truth. For in those furrows are sown not only seeds of wheat, but seeds of memory. Every stroke of the plow recalls faintly the rising of 1381, when men dared to claim that they too had a voice. The image is simple. Dawn breaking over a misty field, the sound of wood and iron in the soil, a farmer guiding his oxen, his face weathered by labor. Outwardly, nothing has changed. The duties remain, the burdens endure. Yet behind his eyes lies a memory, passed down in story and song, that once the people had risen. The rebellion is gone, but the echo remains as enduring as the land itself. And over this image, the narrator speaks the final words. The rising of 1381 did not topple the throne, nor did it abolish the bonds of serfdom in its day, but it planted a seed, that in the history of England, justice would never belong only to kings and nobles. From the commons, too, came the claim to freedom, and though their revolt was broken, their vision endured. The story of England would always be written not just in the halls of power, but in the furrows of its fields, where the lowliest once dared to rise. Thus the film of history closes, not with victory, but with endurance. The peasants of 1381 lost their battle, but they left behind a legacy larger than themselves. They showed that power could be challenged, that voices once silenced could still echo, and that even in failure, rebellion could shape the course of memory. Their revolt was crushed, but their dream lived on, sown deep into the soil of England, destined to grow across the centuries.